Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your location. I'm Dania Dhafar, the Executive Director for Gulf International Forum. Ramadan Mubarak to all of those celebrating. Thank you for joining us for this timely and important virtual discussion about the war in Yemen. In 2011, Yemen appeared as the model success story for the Arab Spring, yet shortly thereafter, following the footsteps of many regional counterparts, Yemen fell into the abyss of conflict. The US-supported GCC initiative signed in Riyadh fell apart, which led to the still ongoing war between the Hadi government and the Houthis. While Yemen has constantly been challenged in maintaining its unity, this crisis has caused Yemen to evolve into a playing field, a chessboard for proxy wars of regional players, each of which that have used the conflict as a theater to protect their interest. As time has progressed, the war has become more complex with divergent interests stemming from militaries of state actors to various non-state actors. Regrettably, for the average Yemeni citizen, they perilously inherited the worst humanitarian crisis and economic crisis in Yemen's modern history. According to the EU, by the end of this year, Yemen will have achieved the distinction of becoming the poorest country in the world per capita. In this context, key questions arise. What lessons can be learned from previous rounds of peace negotiations that can inform prospects for a future resolution? Will the so-called ceasefire hold? How will the Southern Transitional Council's declared takeover in Yemen, in South Yemen, affect the prospect of brokering peace? What would the anatomy of a future Yemeni state look like? With all of these far-reaching questions, we are honored to welcome His Excellency, Dr. Bakr Al-Qirbi, again, the longest-serving foreign minister of Yemen, occupying the position from 2001 to 2014. He first-handedly witnessed critical events within the region, the Arab Spring, the Gulf Initiative to end the crisis, the national dialogue, and probably in the very beginnings of the onset of this ongoing unfortunate war. If he's not qualified to discuss the subject matter of today, then I really don't know who is. And also, what a better person to facilitate this discussion than Ambassador Barbara Bodine, who coincidentally served as the US ambassador to Yemen during Dr. Al-Qirbi's tenure as he was serving as Yemen's foreign minister. Ambassador Bodine has over 30 years in foreign service experience, and is currently a distinguished professor at in the practice of diplomacy, and also the director of the study of diplomacy at Georgetown University. We are very fortunate to host these two distinguished and exceptionally qualified individuals for a conversation about the ongoing conflict in Yemen. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Bodine, who will lead the discussion with His Excellency, Dr. Al-Qirbi.
Thank you very much, Danya, and Ramadan Mubarak to all who are observing that. And thank you for putting together this video meeting, which is reaching a much broader audience than, we'll put a good gloss on it. We're able to reach far more people through Zoom than we would if we were trying to do this in Washington. And I have to state at the outset, as you may have already noticed, I have a very bad internet connection. So if every once in a while I just stop, Danya will leap in and keep going. So I apologize. Dr. Qirbi, Your Excellency, it is always good to see you, even through a camera. And I can't think of anyone better qualified to talk with us this morning, afternoon, evening about what are the prospects for peace in Yemen. What is some of the good news? What is some of the more worrisome news? And from your extensive experience, what are some of the lessons learned from the failed, incomplete efforts that have taken part over the last 5 years? So I'd like to turn it over to you to make some opening comments on where Yemen in the peace process is, and then we can get into some more specific questions. So, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you, Dania, for your invitation to Gulf International Forum. May I also pass my Ramadan greetings to all Muslims watching this visual broadcast, and to the blessing goes to all humanity, really, who are now, we are all in the same battle and suffering as a result of the COVID-19 virus, which I hope will bring us together and will bring sense to many politicians now who do not think except about politics and forget about humanity and humanitarian impact of politics. So going back to your question, Barbara, I think the lesson so far, I think in my mind, having participated in so many negotiations from Geneva to Bale to Kuwait, and subsequently in many indirect negotiations. I think the failure is that whenever we strike a deal, we lose that opportunity. The question is, why did we lose all these opportunities from Geneva, well, the second Geneva, not Geneva 1, but in Bale, when we met and we were close to reaching an agreement, and then they decided it was Christmas times and we have to stop. Okay, which was unfortunate. I think if we could have had a better Christmas if we have won the battle for Yemen. And the same thing happened in Kuwait the second time, after 2 months, when we were approaching the solution, and then somehow everybody was thinking about Eid al-Fitr in 2015. And again, we lost that opportunity of concluding an agreement on a number of draft agreements on various aspects of the conflict. And again, how useful it would have been if we concluded that meeting with an agreement to end the conflict in Yemen. Now, why did this happen? I cannot really answer this question, because I'd have to delve into the intentions of those who were forcing the delay, or for those who did not want really an agreement to be reached. But I think once we hopefully embark now on new negotiations for a comprehensive political solution in Yemen, I think we have to really ensure that we do not lose this opportunity. When it happens, I hope it will happen soon. But if you remember, when we were in the last forum in last November in Washington, we were hoping that according to the so-called promising events going on in Riyadh, and a lot of statements envoy December, and nothing has happened since then, unfortunately.
You mentioned the COVID crisis, which is one of the reasons that we're all on Zoom today. And I actually heard a briefing yesterday by Lise Grande, the UN Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, and she was talking about the impact of COVID in a situation such as Yemen's. My understanding is that Martin Griffith is working on a ceasefire. The Saudis have said they agreed to it. Not really, I like your views on whether or not there's anything behind it. But one of the proposals, as I understand it, well, it sounds rather grotesque, but to take the COVID reality and use it as a stepping stone forward, is to establish something like a joint COVID emergency center where all sides would put aside their politics and put aside the other grievances and really focus on how to manage, mitigate, address the COVID threat in Yemen. Is the Secretary General's call for COVID ceasefires and the work of Martin Griffith and this idea of a joint COVID center, is there any reality behind that? Is this going to be the wedge that finally starts bringing people to the table to look at the situation of the Yemeni people as opposed to their individual parties' agendas?
Well, Excellency, I think the COVID-19 impact on Yemen, which can be disaster if it actually takes the scope we have seen in the United States or in Britain. But my impression really that the Yemeni people now are suffering from so many diseases apart from COVID-19.
Yeah.
There have been for many, they've been dying from lack of medication, lack of tertiary care, lack of medications, and so on. And therefore, COVID-19 to the ordinary Yemeni is just an additional illness. Okay. And to them, really, what matters now, are we going to end the whole suffering for the Yemeni people, or is it piecemeal? Okay. People are not interested now in piecemeal solutions. People would like to see a comprehensive solution for the conflict and to the suffering of the Yemeni people. Now, the COVID-19 issue actually could have been dealt with in a much simpler way than the enormous media traction that created about it. Because all it needed is really for Liz Grant and those who are working on the humanitarian side is to coordinate with both sides of the conflict on how they can organize a system of coordination to combat COVID-19 when it comes. And therefore the special envoy should have really devoted all his time at the root cause of the problem, and that is the war and how to end the war. Because ending the war in itself is going to resolve a lot, not only COVID-19, but probably many of the other sufferings of the Yemenis.
No, I agree. And I think that there is a broad agreement that this conflict does not have a military solution. It is largely stalemated, and it's going to require a political solution that addresses all of the grievances and demands something that you've been calling for since at least March 2015. What would be the parameters, the framework of this comprehensive approach? How did you mentioned a couple of efforts that almost made it, at least two of them interrupted by holidays. What were the sticking points and how would you address those? How do you get past that?
I think, as you know, the components of the war, there is a Yemeni component and a regional component. Okay, the regional component really are the interests of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the concerns of legitimate concerns of Saudis of any threat to them from Yemen. Okay, and I think this is an issue that can no Yemeni will disagree about. Even the Houthis, I think, if they come to talk about it, just they may have their own also grievances as the Saudi Arabia, and therefore they have to sort out how can we really address both sides' grievances and concerns and fears. So that is one side of the story. The other side of the story for us as Yemenis, I think, is how are we going to look to the future of Yemen? And I think a lot of the outline of that has come in the outcome of the National Dialogue, Comprehensive Dialogue, which over 10 years to develop. Now, there are a few issues that are not resolved, territories, what type of government, the constitution, and so on. These can be elements for the negotiation when people meet. But there are the issues of the disarmament of the militias. There are the issues of moving the Ansar Allah from now the control of many of the government institutions in Sana'a. Regarding the issue of, I think, which is of concern to us, to Yemeni, is democracy, state, what type of democratic system are we going to have for Yemen? The outline of this is already, as I said, there, the outcome of the National Comprehensive NDC, National Dialogue. Okay. And if one now just puts these in front of the Yemeni parties to negotiate about what is acceptable and not acceptable, I'm sure that those that have to be renegotiated are very few, very limited. Now, why are we not able to do that? We are not able to do that because sometimes, and this is what happened in Kuwait, and I've said this repeatedly, that the government side, legitimacy side, will insist that we should implement the military side of the deal. And Ansar Allah will say, no, we have to implement first the political. The issue is political. We have to deal with the political issues, and then we'll come to the implementation of the military. Both have some rights, but they cannot impose each position on the other. So there has to be a compromise, and the compromise was reached that we have to make a comprehensive solution, and then we agree on the timing process for the process implementation. Okay. So I think the special envoy now has the challenge of how to really put together all these documents that are in his hands from Kuwait, which address all these issues that I have said, and put them in a sort of a proposed solution for the Yemeni conflict, and go with this to the United Nations Security Council to approve it as a negotiation ground for the Yemenis, so that at least the Yemenis know that there is the United Security Council is putting this to them, will observe what's happening, who is obstructive and who is not obstructive, and will give them the guarantees that may be needed because of the mistrust once the process of implementation takes place.
I want to follow up on that last point. What do you see as the role of you talked about the Security Council providing the necessary guarantees to give the parties the trust to move forward, if I understood you correctly. What kind of guarantees or what kind of mechanisms does the UN have to do that in a conflict such as we have in Yemen?
For me, I think the most important guarantee is how the UN Security Council can help all the parties to agree on establishing a national armed forces and to dismantle the armed militias. This is really the threat to any solution. And therefore, the guarantee is to how to establish a national armed forces based on the loyalty to the country, to the people of Yemen, and not to political parties or tribes or. And if they start with this as one part of the guarantee, which will protect really the implementation of the political solution once people agree on it, I think we'll be taking the first step forward.
Okay. What kind of, you mentioned the national dialogue, and Dr. Danya also talked about how the early days of the Arab Spring in Yemen, and the optimism that many of us had that Yemen was going to actually come out of the Arab Spring process successfully. And I think the NDC was almost a unique experience in the region during that time. And it came very, very close. It was a remarkable process. But as you mentioned, it finally collapsed on the issue of the structure of the state. Is it federal, supra regions, a secession of the South, an autonomous status for the South? There were many, many issues, but that seemed to be the one that it finally fell on. This, I think, has been complicated, or at least heightened, by the creation of the Southern Transition Council, which, as you know, just declared its self-rule. And interestingly, at least to date, Shabwa, Hadramaut, and Socotra have said they don't want any part of it. And even the UAE, which is the main supporter of the Southern Transition Council, has stated their opposition to this. What kind of shape of Yemen is the most reasonable, acceptable, probable outcome? Is it a unitary state with special statuses? Does it divide? And even if it were to divide, given that other parts of the South have said they don't want anything to do with the STC's declaration, how does this play out? What kind of a Yemen, how many Yemens are we looking at going forward?
Well, fortunately, I cannot answer this question for a number of reasons, really. I do not have enough, really, to believe that STC, and you have actually indicated to that in your statement, STC represents really the southern people's position on the unity of Yemen. Okay, they may represent a number, whether they are 10% or 80%, we don't know. So I think we have always to avoid falling into the trap of any group coming and saying we represent Yemen. Okay, yeah. Because any other party can say they represent the South, we represent the whole Yemen. Okay, and then you have to battle that. And therefore, I think a decision on such matters should be really left until people agree on how to stabilize the situation in Yemen first. Because the stabilization of Yemen in the first place, security-wise, economic-wise, removing all these barriers and restrictions and so on, and normalizing the situation may eliminate a lot of the grievances that existed in the past if we move to a transitional period that focuses on these issues. Okay? So I think, and therefore I think if the issue of this, whether there should be 6 territories or 2 territories, or maybe the existing system of 22 governorates is what is better for Yemen, I would say that this is a personal point of view. During the process of the stabilization of Yemen, we have to maintain the existing governorates. It is easier to administer. It is less expensive to administer, but you have to give more authority to the local governments in these governorates and their fair share of power and wealth. Okay. And if this happens, I'm sure a lot of the grievances will subside. I may be a little theoretical, okay, I'm sorry, but this is how I see things. And then I think if people agree after the transitional period, and we hope there will be a short transitional period, and there is elections, that will not abide by the full democracy after the elections. We agree that there will continue to be a sharing of power after the election between the major political parties. So they are all responsible to stabilize for maybe 2 or 3 terms of government, parliamentary periods, and to work on these sensitive issues, the constitution and the territorial divisions of Yemen, whether it is a federal state, whether it is just a unitary state, but with 6 territories or 2 or 3 territories. These decisions are very difficult to take now when people are so vexed about such little things that are important but are not a priority at this time, because if we focus on them at this stage, we will only enhance the process of conflict rather than to get Yemen out of this.
Can I just clarify one point that you made, and this also goes to a question from one of our listeners, one of our participants. You mentioned the political parties dealing with this as part of the transition. Are you talking about the GPC and the JMP, the Joint Meeting Party? How do you bring in other actors who have evolved? And kind of as a part of that, describing who are the parties, how does in a sense, the legitimization of the STC, and I agree with your assessment of it, but it was legitimized as a player through the Riyadh Agreement. I mean, that was between the Hadi government and the STC, which gives the STC a certain status. So when you talk about the political parties who are going to manage this transition, and I personally agree with you that the shape of the state is a long-term question and can't be addressed yet. Who are those parties who are part of this? Where does the GPC sit? Where does the JMP sit? What do you do about the Houthi? What do you do about the STC? And any number of other players?
I think that's an important question, and I've was asked this by many others. And let me tell you or remind the listeners or those who are watching us that the whole process that existed after 2011 was based on a consensus between political parties. And that Hadi and the government and everything that happened after that was based on the GCC initiative and its implementation plan. And therefore, Hadi's legitimacy now is not only constitutional, but also is as a result of a political agreement between the political parties. They are the ones who agreed upon him. They are the ones who nominated him to run as a president, and they are the ones who prevented anybody to run against him as a president. Okay, so they are the ones who have given him that legitimacy. It's not only constitution. Now, who are the signatories to the GCC initiatives? There were 2 parties, the GPC and its allying parties, and GMP. Okay, so they have, I think these 2 groups have legitimate right to be part of any political negotiation for the future of Yemen. The others, we have 2 important groups now. Ansar Allah, who are now a de facto group that has to be part in this, and the Southerners. When I am talking about Southerners and not STC.
Okay.
So I believe this is the group that should be involved in the comprehensive negotiations for peace in Yemen, and to resolve really all the other issues, what is to be done during the transitional period, what has to be delayed until after the transitional period.
To be successful, peace negotiations need to be inclusive. how do you bring in two groups that were very much involved in Change Square and in the NDC, women and youth, so that the arrangements, the agreement is as comprehensive and there's as much buy-in as possible? Or is this only a conversation between the two parties as of 2011 with something else with new players that have emerged?
Well, I think this will depend how we will structure the negotiations. Okay, I think one has to be very careful in structuring negotiations. I think you have seen the effort by the Russians with the Syrians and the multitude of things they have invited to talk about or to negotiate a settlement, and they all failed because you cannot include everybody. You see, there are many parties or groups that when they come, they just come to thinking of what is my share of the cake, and not how I ensure that I address the issues that are important, that my share of the cake will be in making the right decisions, in helping and making the right decisions, so that in the end I will get my share of the cake. Okay, but not as necessarily by making it a priority to just ensure that I get my piece of the cake. So I think, and in Yemen, you see, unfortunately, after 2011, because of the American and Western encouragement for multitude of NGOs and parties, and there are hundreds of NGOs who think they have a share in the process. Well, okay, we agree they should have a share of the process, but should they be in the direct negotiations or on the sideline of the negotiations so that people can share with them their points of view? Can they be part of the official parties in the negotiations? So there are many ways of dealing with how to present various groups. And I think this is where the special envoy and those who are planning for the future negotiation, where they have to be innovative in this process.
Okay. You've talked about the GPC being part of the process. Like so many other actors within the Yemen conflict, the GPC has some of its own divisions. And so, we've talked about, who represents the South. I'm not sure what the standing is of the JMP at this stage. And then GPC has its own internal divisions. How do you even get the core players to have enough unity of approach to be able to take this process forward?
Well, again, let me be candid with you and say that the only party now amongst the Yemeni parties that is really, so far, and even there are questions now, that's united are Ansarullah. All the other parties have divisions of themselves. Whether you talk about Al-Islah or GPC or Nasrites or Ba'ath, there are divisions because there are those who feel they are with the legitimate government and those who feel that the legitimate government does not represent them. Okay? They are not with the Ansar Allah, but they are not also with the legitimate government. And therefore, I think, as I said regarding to the all-inclusive, I think when people start to talk about GPC, for example, and let me talk about GPC, I think GPC, if we eliminate the pressures on GPC from those who are trying to influence its decisions, whether it is Ansar Allah or KSA or Emirates, you will find GPC will get its act right and will choose the right delegation to represent it.
Thank you for your segue to my next question. When many people talk about this conflict, they talk about it as, you know, the Saudi-led coalition. You know, that's the short version. There's a lot of short versions in our media. But as you well know, there's a number of players. Most importantly, at least on that side, are the Emirates, who have been very active supporters of the STC. They've been very active in as the boots on the ground. Yet they have also now decided to withdraw and, interestingly, did not support the self-rule declaration. What do you see as the Emirates' agenda, its goals, and its possible role in moving this to a negotiated settlement? Where do the Emiratis come out in all of this?
I think the Emiratis and the Saudis, when we discussed with them the issue of Yemen and what's their agenda for Yemen, they will all say that our agenda is to stand with the legitimate government. Our stand is to ensure that Yemen returns to stability, normalcy, that Yemen unity and territorial integrity is maintained and protected. So this is the declaration we hear from them. And I will tend to say I'll have to accept it at this stage, because we are in a stage where we are not, we want to test people. We are in a state where we want to ensure that people adhere to what they commit to.
Mm-hmm. But you don't see any divergence between the Saudi objectives in Yemen and in the war, and therefore in whatever peace comes out of it?
Well, I think
the Emiratis are looking for?
What is I mean, repeatedly said, and I think these days every day I receive one or two articles published in the United States about the conflict in Yemen from various centers with the various sponsors, and they have all sometimes very conflicting analysis of the situation in Yemen, which confuses me as well. So sometimes I start to believe maybe I don't know as much as the experts know, and therefore you are now asking me questions that may be misguided by these many reports. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, all right. You were the foreign minister for a very long time. Your diplomatic skills are showing. And I can't possibly let this conversation go any longer without talking about the other major regional player, and that would be the Iranian role. How do they factor into going forward on a process and into a future Yemen?
I'm sure, Barbara, you and I met last time. We talked that my concern after the war started, the conflict, is that the longer this war goes on, the more players will come into it. Okay. At the beginning of the war, we knew that Iran has interest in what was going on, but not to the extent that it is at the moment. And then after that, it is not only Iran, then Turkey came into the picture, and Qatar is becoming another player. Okay. So it is now not only the coalition, but those who are maybe in conflict with the coalition are becoming important players. And this is what complicates the picture even further for us. And every one of them has his pros and his cons, okay, for his involvement. So in this situation, I think the important thing now for those, whether they are regional or international players, is to decide, especially I think the United States of America, Britain, and the 5 permanent members, would they like to see Yemen go further to the downhill, or they would like to stop at least the downhill going? Okay. And I think this is the first step that has to be addressed. How can we stop further deterioration of the situation? How can we stop further interference in the affairs of the Yemenis? How can we empower the Yemenis themselves to take responsibility for finding a solution for themselves? Okay. No one is going to agree to do it unless there is an agreement of all to do the same. Now, who has the key to this is a very difficult one to answer.
Yeah, I don't see, we've seen very little evidence that the Security Council can act in concert on almost any issue at this point. I agree with you that it will take a concerted agreement on the future of Yemen. I'm not sure that I can see that the various players can get to that agreement. The other new issue, because, you know, let's take the optimistic, I will always be somewhat optimistic, that a political solution will be found, a viable process will begin. Yemen, after this conflict, and I do believe there will be an after this conflict, will need major rebuilding, major reconstruction, political, social, economic, and infrastructure, and will need a great deal of assistance from the outside world. However, at this particular point, all those, both in the West and in the region, are suffering from their own very real economic challenges. Oil has dropped to, you know, it's less than, it's not worth the barrel that it's in. How has both the distraction that every country has to deal with COVID amongst their own people, and this great wobbling of the international economic structure with the collapse of oil, how is that going to factor into Yemen being able to get the attention, the assistance, the commitment that it will need to rebuild?
Well, I think you are really raising a question that now doesn't concern Yemen only, it concerns the whole world, really. I think the COVID-19 and the impact of the economic crisis that is felt all over the world, I think, with the fall of the prices of oil and the revenues for various countries, especially those who are dependent on their energy resources, like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and the GCC countries, and Iran as well. But Iran has done a little better as far as really diversifying its economy. But and I'm sure you've been also reading about the post-COVID-19 era and what it will have its impact on the economy and the relations between countries and so on. Now, as far as Yemen is concerned, our main concern, of course, is even if there is a commitment to rebuild Yemen by GCC countries and some of the donors to Yemen, we cannot expect now that we will get that big share as we would have been anticipated if the situation was normal. Okay, and therefore I think what Yemen will need is really to see how it can rebuild its own resources, really, how to manage its resources as well. And I think to me, this now should be a major issue even in the future comprehensive negotiations is the economy, so that it is structured in a manner that can provide the state with the resources and restore its normalcy, and also put a halt really to the corruption that existed in the past.
Okay, one very last question to let you wrap it up. Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist going forward?
Well, if I wasn't an optimist, I wouldn't be here. Okay.
Yeah.
And having you here in front of me makes me even more optimistic.
No.
Because I know there are in the US and many other parts of the world people who really are concerned about what's happening in Yemen, and their voices are making an impact on policymakers. Unfortunately, COVID now has obscured that. Okay, that's another impact of COVID on Yemen.
Yeah.
More so than COVID. Okay. But let us hope, I think, that the special envoy now will readdress his agenda for Yemen, and how he would really get Yemenis, as I said earlier, to be empowered, to take responsibility, and that he only monitor the process.
Well, I think I think maybe it's, if I have any of my students on this, they will have heard this before, but anyone who is a diplomat has to be an optimist in order to get up in the morning and try again, and a pragmatist in order to get through the rest of the day. And so your diplomatic credentials have shown through over this last hour. I agree with you that we can be optimistic, but the world that we are currently living in, with the distraction of COVID, with the economic issues, and the world just simply being distracted is really perhaps this is even, you know, a good point, that it really allows the focus to be back on the Yemenis to find the resolution to this issue, work through the agreement, and come up with a solution that fits Yemen and what Yemen needs and wants. Sometimes outside support can actually be an outside interference. And as you noted, there is no shortage of countries who are operating in Yemen for their own agendas rather than Yemen's agenda. And so perhaps this will create the space, if possible, for something to move forward. And then the world can step up and assist. That's the best I can do as a retired diplomat at this point.
A very experienced one, and a very concerned diplomat about Yemen. Thank you very much, Barbara.
And I want to thank everyone who has been on this meeting. I want to thank those of you who proposed questions, which I was able to share with His Excellency. And again, very much our thanks to the Gulf Forum for putting this event together. Timely, informative, hopeful, but realistic at the same time. So this was an hour I think we can all say was well spent. And Your Excellency, thank you very much for all your time, your candor, and your insights.
Thank you very much, all, and to Dania and to the Institute.
Absolutely.